I once had a class where we were exploring the nativity stories. We divided into 4 groups, and each of us took one of the Gospels and went looking for the stories of Jesus' birth. 2 of the groups quickly figured out that their Gospels didn't have any nativity stories. Mark and John don't start with the birth of Jesus. Matthew and Luke do. And so then we divided into 2 groups and explored those stories. On the board, we listed all the things that we associated with the Christmas story and then went looking for them in the 2 Gospels. And there were lots of things we found, shepherds and mangers and angels and such, and then things that were missing, like Christmas trees or stockings, or maybe even St. Nicholas. One of the things that was not there was the 3 kings. The Gospels reference magi, wise men, magi like magician, like folks who know the ways of the world, but it doesn't mention 3 kings. We know the 3 kings from the song, "We 3 kings of Orient are," but it comes from the song, not the Gospel. Someone in the class was discouraged and disappointed and maybe even heartbroken to discover that this piece of the story that they had treasured wasn't in the Bible. It seems like often what we know or think we know may be different than what actually is when it comes to biblical stories. So tonight we're going to explore those a little bit. And we have a question or 2 about the Christmas story to start off.
Why is Jesus and his family so often portrayed as white or European?
That's a really good question. And it's true in a lot of the paintings, particularly from Europe, Jesus and the family, and honestly, most of the people in the Bible, are painted as though they're Europeans. Light skin, light hair. There are plenty of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus pictures out there. Now granted, since this was 20 centuries ago, we don't have pictures of what he looked like. We don't have paintings from that time. But we know that he was Middle Eastern. He was a Jew. He was a Semite from that part of the world where most people then and now are swarthy. They have dark hair and darker skin. And it's also true that people in different countries and cultures all over the world depict biblical figures in their own image. So it's not surprising that Europeans paint Jesus as one of their own children. But it's also true now that we have access to artists from all over the world that we see images of Jesus and his family and other biblical figures in all colors and cultures, just like in the nativities that you saw at the nativity walk at our church. We had nativities from countries and cultures all over the world showing Jesus in a different light. Do you have other questions? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about why it is that we have stories in our head that are different than the stories in the Gospels. And one simple reason is that we have romanticized those stories. Sometimes we have learned those stories as children when we were in Sunday school, and frankly haven't spent much time with the Bible or with biblical studies since confirmation, or maybe never. And so we often have sort of childlike remembrances of those stories and haven't looked at those texts as grown-ups. We haven't read them with a critical eye. We haven't dug into them to see what's there and what they might mean. So I've noticed that we often romanticize those stories. And this story in this season gets romanticized a lot. This is actually a pretty rough story. There's awkwardness in it. And so when we gloss over it and make it pretty and make it neat, we miss a lot of the significance of what's really going on. So for instance, it's important when we remember the story, when we read the story, to recognize that Mary and Joseph lived in the Middle East and Palestine at a time when they were occupied by the Roman Empire. And the Romans were not necessarily kind, as occupation forces often are. So we gloss over the oppression of that, the occupation of that. We gloss over the fact that Mary is an unmarried teen mom, and can often be judgmental of people who've had that experience while romanticizing Mary as so faithful. Joseph was in a tough spot because he seemed really clear that this child was not his, and yet his bride-to-be was pregnant. It's embarrassing, it's awkward. Legally, he could have had her stoned, but he's a nice guy. He's a faithful guy, so he decides he'll just leave well enough alone and move on. Until an angel appears and says, no, this is something really special. Hang in there. There's good news coming. And then they have to travel. And anyone who's ever traveled while pregnant or traveled with someone who's pregnant when they're really pregnant, it's really hard. It's hard on your body. It's hard on your nerves. So when they get to Bethlehem from Nazareth and there's no place to stay, can you imagine the anxiety and the tension? And they do find a place to stay. And it's not a great place. It's not sweet-smelling hay necessarily. Anybody who's spent time in a barn knows that barns get messy. Animals are messy. And yet this is the place they have. All of this takes place within the context of Herod as well, who's ruling in this part of the world at the time. And Herod was a violent man. He was known for his violence. And he was threatened when the Magi appeared and said that they were coming to see the newborn king of the Jews. He lied and said, oh, please come tell me when you find him because I'd like to come pay my respects too. He had no intention of doing any such thing. He wanted to kill his competition. And that's why Mary and Joseph, after Jesus is born, run. They become refugees and run away to Egypt to safeguard this child, this special child, from Herod's violence. The remarkable thing about these stories is that they are ordinary people. Mary and Joseph aren't magical. Even the Magi aren't magical. They're more like scientists, wise men who study and learn and discover what's happening in the world. Herod is an ordinary oppressor. The shepherds are ordinary. The innkeepers are ordinary and kind. God does extraordinary things with ordinary people, just like you and me. This is the blessing and the opportunity of the Christmas season, to discover what sort of extraordinary things God might be calling you to do. So in these days to come, between now and Christmas, and in the 12 days of Christmas following it, I invite you to consider what extraordinary things might be happening in your life, what you might be able to do, what you might recognize as miraculous in your world. May the blessings of the Christmas season be yours.